Hi, I'm Lance Humphries. I'm the Executive Director of the Mount Vernon Place Conservancy, and welcome to Flower Mart. I am pleased to be here today on behalf of the Conservancy to talk about the long and rich history of Mount Vernon Place and to discuss, whether it's been a park or a garden or a square over time. And to really talk about this is going to be a lot of hopefully some new images for you all. There is an incredible photographic record and painted record and drawn record of Mount Vernon Place. But to begin, we're going to go back way back about 200 years in Baltimore history to when Baltimore was a very young city. And you may know that Baltimore as a city was incorporated in 1797, but had been founded, laid out in 1730, but it really didn't grow much till after the Revolutionary War. And the 1780s and 90s were a really boom time in Baltimore, and it grew quite a bit. This painting that we're seeing by Francis Guy is looking down Charles Street, if you can imagine it, from about Pleasant Street, and those buildings in the near distance are really about where Saratoga Street is today. And we're looking kind of to the southeast to the Fells Point area, way off in the distance, and actually Federal Hill across the harbor. And I'm showing you this because there would be no Mount Vernon Place without the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument and its origins are really why we have Mount Vernon Place today and where it is today. So you can see in this painting, and I'm going to go into a detail here in a minute, but we're kind of going to go to about 2/3 from the right as a detail here. And I'm going to show you that there was a courthouse, the very early courthouse in the city, really in what is today's Battle Monument Square at Calvert Street between Lexington and Fayette. And this building, by the 1800s period, right about when we're seeing it here, was really in quite a ruinous state, and they knew that they needed to somehow replace it. And when the citizens who built houses around it, you can see kind of rows of houses on either side of it, learned that the courthouse was going to be torn down, they were concerned that some unsightly thing was going to be built in its place. So, among other reasons, they decided that they were going to erect originally a statue of Washington about 1807 in its place, and that they had formed a subscription. Well, by 1810, those plans had really blossomed into the idea of an actual memorial to Washington, and it may have been because it was the 10th anniversary of Washington's death. And so they petitioned the Maryland State Legislature for a lottery, that they could run a lottery to raise $100,000 to erect this new memorial that was going to replace this courthouse when it was torn down. Well, they commissioned a competition, and Robert Mills, excuse me, of South Carolina, won with this design for a very tall column, about 150 feet tall, that was going to replace the courthouse, and very different than what we have today. But when those who lived around the square learned that it was going to be built, and this was the design chosen, they became concerned, and I'm sorry, this is some very hokey cut and paste here. They became concerned that this very tall column, which probably would have been about this tall versus their houses, would fall on their houses in the event of some kind of natural disaster, an earthquake or something. Now, we're not particularly prone to earthquakes in this area, so why this was such a concern is rather interesting. But their concerns, won the day, and the board of managers who were building the monument had to find a new location. So they turned to John Eager Howard, who owned much of the land north of the city, and his Belvedere estate, which is kind of where the Mount Vernon area is today. And on the left, you can see an early plat. The square at the bottom is where they originally planned to have the monument, but that they asked him to donate a square 200 by 200 feet on his property. And you can see that I marked out a little square there. Really, you can tell it was even a hilltop at the time, kind of southwest of his mansion, Belvedere. And he willingly agreed to do that. And so they're now, getting ready to build this monument and erect it when they finally have the money from the lottery. And you can see on the right that Robert Mills is thinking about, how is my monument going to look when these streets get built? And Monument Street, which didn't exist so much at the time, is laid out, and Charles is extended north. And you can see it would have been a pretty mean little situation there with very little space around it. However, the cornerstone was laid in 1815 in clearly what was a wooded area. It was called Howard's Woods at the time. And by that time, Robert Mills's design had greatly changed to pretty much what we have today, although there's some details that are changed. Now, this print from 1815 shows it rather in this wooded setting. Excuse me, we're not sure if that's, the actual woods or just kind of pretend trees that the artist has done for kind of artistic effect, but it definitely was in the woods. And the monument continued to be built. In the early 1820s, it looked like this, basically just missing the statue up top and some details. And Poppleton, who laid out the city in 1822, you can see on the right, he kind of showed what this 200 by 200 foot square would look like. These are, imaginary blocks that didn't exist at the time, but how that would look. And so it's very different than what we have today. But it still was very much in the woods. And really the earliest actual depiction that we have of Mount Vernon Place is this circa 1830 watercolor by Robert Carey Long. He's showing, looking up Charles Street here, which is just a dirt road. You can see on the right of that road, if we can even call it that, all this earth and soil and probably sand that they had just thrown off the top of this hillside as they dug out the area where the monument was going to be, which is where the Peabody is today, if you can imagine that. And that Center Street is in the foreground, just a dirt road, and that around the monument there really is nothing laid out. It's just kind of grass and trees. And, some of these were certainly actually there. Whether they're in the exact location, we don't know, because this is a print or a drawing and not a real photograph. However, the first house had been built on the square right there to the right. That's Charles Howard. He was one of the children of John Eager Howard and built the first kind of mansion on the square on the northeast corner where the church is today. So it all looks very rough there around 1830, but at the same time, the Howard heirs are deciding how to lay out and kind of distribute their father's estate. John Eager Howard died in 1827, and all of his children, a very large bunch of children, they all were able to divide up his, massive property that he owned kind of north of Center Street up to his mansion, which was about where the Belvedere is today. The Belvedere Hotel is today. And they decided to lay out these two broad avenues and extend the original 200 by 200 square foot area their father had given as public spaces. And they did this to give the monument more space and more generous, surrounding. However, they also owned all of the building lots around the square. And so they knew that by developing this with this eventually what would be green in the middle, they would all have very valuable building lots to sell to prospective people to build, largely very large houses, many of them mansions. And this early 1830s plat here shows probably an imaginary look at what the green spaces might be because it's so early. But importantly, they called them Mount Vernon Place to the east-west and Washington Place to the north-south, obviously both in honor of George Washington and his home in Virginia. And you can see here that Charles Howard's house is shown there on the upper right. So this is really early, probably, excuse me, about 1833. But to give a reality of what that looked like at the time, we are fortunate that we have this print from 1835. We are looking east from about where maybe the Severn is today. And so Charles Howard's house would be hidden behind that tree on the left. And you can see that there really are no houses other than Charles Howard's. It's hidden and that it's very rough terrain. That kind of gully in the middle of the picture running kind of left to right is about where Center Street is, and that there are no squares as they had, kind of laid out on that early plat, and that it's still just woods. Now, whether these are the actual trees that were there, we don't know, but there was no actual design. And there are a couple of comments from the 1830s and 40s that, the monument has been built, but that these squares are awaiting embellishment. And that took a good 10 years to kind of realize. The first photograph that we have of Mount Vernon Place is this image, and probably this is one of the first this may be the earliest photograph in the city of Baltimore. It's between 1845 and 1848, and we know that because of two things that I'll talk about in a minute. The Maryland Center for History and Culture, formerly the Maryland Historical Society, just acquired this incredible daguerreotype. Incredible because, as I said, it's probably the first image of the city. So you can see here that by the late 1840s, there had been more development on Mount Vernon Place. The Charles Howard House is on the right there. A house built by the Greenway family is to the left, built in the mid-30s, and then the house to our left, the 5-bay White House, they're built by the Tiffany family in the early 1840s, now the Mount Vernon Club. But importantly, in the front left corner, you can just see a big chunk of, two things. You can see that the square, if we could even call it that, on the south side it's just grass or dirt. There's really nothing that has taken place there other than the roads are kind of laid out. And to the left of that, there's a big chunk of land, or at least a large lot. And that is where the Thomas House would be built, now known as Hackerman House or 1 West Mount Vernon Place. And there is nothing there, and no development has taken place. And that means that the photograph is before 1848 when that house was started. The other thing that we can date this image by is that there is a white picket fence around the West Square. That was installed in 1845. So that's how we know that this image is between 1845 and 48, and really the first view of what Mount Vernon Place looked like at the time. Fortunately, there are other views from this right around the same period. Now we're looking east from the Cathedral Street area, and you can see that West Square that I was showing you a minute ago, but with a few more houses in place. So we're probably more towards the late 40s now. The big pile of dirt on the right there actually may be the Thomas House under construction on that corner, which would mean it's around 1848, 49. And this is kind of this typical design and layout that they would do to the squares in this period, 1845-50, that they were all eventually encircled by white picket fences, encircled by matching trees, completely encircled. And then in the interior, there were just grass. And, it seems to be a design of evergreen trees. They're just kind of, plopped down there like lollipops or something. What we don't know is there's very little discussion about how these squares functioned when they were fenced in. The original laying out of the squares in the early 1830s actually took place around the same time as Gramercy Park, for instance, in New York. But Gramercy Park, the park proper, was actually owned by the residents around it. Unlike Mount Vernon Place, this was always a public space. And so we don't really know. There are no images showing people walking that I know of inside the squares. They obviously would perambulate around the exterior, but there were gates, as you'll see in a minute. But there's just not a lot of discussion about how active the use was inside of these squares, or whether you were just supposed to look at them. Now, one last image from that period. This is 1850, and we're now looking south. Once again, the West Square is on our right. You can see that all the squares have been encircled with these cast iron, with picket fences, white picket fences, encircled with trees, few little trees in the middle of the greenswards inside of them. And obviously more houses around the square. The Thomas House is now what we call Hackerman's House, now there in place in its original brown paint. It was actually painted brown originally. And so this design of trees encircling fences lasted for a good 25 years, but 5 years later, in 1855, they decided to replace all of these wooden fences with cast iron fences, which obviously are more permanent than wood. They do require painting, just like a wood fence does. And so all of the squares were encircled with cast iron fences. And here we're looking up the South Square, actually in both of these stereographs. The closer view on the left there with the yellow border. Interestingly, and I hadn't really thought about it till I've seen these photographs for a number of years, but as I was putting this together, it is interesting that both of these images are taken during the winter. And I think one of the reasons why they took these during the winter is that when all of these trees that encircled the square were in leaf, you couldn't see the monument. We have a really close up here on the left, but in the image on the right, which is a little small, I'm sorry, there's actually a tree or several trees in front of the gate area there. So when that was all in bloom during the summer, there was this kind of ring of trees that completely surrounded the square. Interestingly, McHenry Howard, who I'll mention a couple times, he was one of the children of Charles Howard and was born in that house there and grew up. He mentioned in a recollection in the early 20th century, around 1917, that this was something they kind of realized as these trees grew up, that they were blocking these views of the monument, and that is something that was changed over time. So it's interesting. There are a lot of planned moments in Mount Vernon Place and its landscape and garden history. And then there are some things that clearly weren't planned and they didn't realize what would happen in the future. So the other thing that McHenry mentions is that it's interesting that he didn't remember the name, but he said that he knew kind of around the 1870s, it was in about 1875, he said a man from Boston was brought in to redesign the North and South squares, and that was Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and his partner Thomas Wysdale. And the firm was brought in on behalf of the city, but Robert Garrett was involved with it, who lived on the square at the time. And the Olmsted firm with Wysdale redesigned the North and South squares. Importantly, they took down the fences that encircled them, and they really landscaped the centers of these squares from these just very simple greenswards that they had been for about 40 years at that time. This is the South Square. We're looking north. You can see there, unfortunately, by this time, Charles Howard's house had been torn down. That's now the Methodist Church there. And you can see that the South Square, we have this very strong axis up the middle looking at the monument, and you'll see that in a couple other images here. A lot of a very rough-hewn stonework. There's a fountain there in the center. And we know that this photograph is dated to 1880, so it's right after the work was just finished. Around that fountain and all those little patches that look like grass from this image, actually there are very small little shrubs planting, and some of them were flowering. But they're just little, maybe a foot and a half tall shrubs in various patterns, circular patterns, semicircular patterns. And these will be kind of part of the story that I talk about for a few more minutes here. Interestingly, you can see here that the East Square, kind of peeking out there between the Peabody and the church, has not been redesigned because that wouldn't take place for another 5 years. And you can see how those trees that were at the end of the squares are really quite tall. And of course, if you were looking from the monument out or from the other way in on any of those squares, you wouldn't have seen the monument very much because its base was hidden by the trees. So this square, the South Square, the other thing that McHenry Howard mentioned, and I think it's so interesting because he was not a landscape architect, is that he said that the Olmsteds, who we did not remember their name, that they treated the South Square differently than the other squares. And he said this was a brilliant idea because the South Square is very steep and very short by comparison. And that if it had all just been green grass, which it had been before, it would have looked very mean and kind of uninspired. But that by kind of framing, as you'll see in a minute, framing it, and since it's steep as you come up Charles Street to see it, by framing the monument with various levels of shrubbery and trees, you kind of added to how much green you saw because you were seeing it at this angle. And that is indeed very true. This is the same square. We're about 1900 now, but a black and white photograph, but kind of looking up with the monument framed by these trees up at the top there and at the bottom, and the shrubbery that is obviously matured since the 1880 photograph. And we're at a wonderful time in the turn of the century where all of a sudden we start getting colored postcards. And so while there wasn't really color photography so much, we can kind of get a sense of what that South Square looked like. As I mentioned, there's trees framing the monument, these rough hewn walls with gas lights, and then these kind of semicircular beds that would be planted with annuals backed by more perennial shrubbery that was there all year round. And so it was this kind of very framing device for the monument, as well as when you were walking up the South Square, which was very important in this period and still is. You had this experience of being in a garden-like space that was a little separated from the street. The Olmsteds did the North Square as well in a very different look. You can see here that I'm sure from the fenced-in period, they have replanted the trees because they're all very uniform within their little semicircular areas there. Once again, the rough-hewn walls. There are discussions that this pavement and this colored postcard, I think they tried to replicate it. It was set on the diagonal, very complicated pattern. And there's one account that it may have been the concrete was stained, I think, red, yellow, and blue. No photograph or even a colored print or postcard shows that level of intensity, but it probably was quite intense. Some people found it garish, I think, including the Garretts. One feature that they did in this square and that the city would replicate elsewhere is a lot of mounding into ovals and circles. The squares were very kind of just for passive walking at this time. You'd kind of stroll through them and walk one way, look at the statues, look at the flower beds, and kind of walk through. The city did not hire the Olmsteds to complete the project, which took place in 1885, once again with Robert Garrett involved, and actually I think he gave quite a bit of money for this phase. The city hired their own architect to kind of design the east on the left and the west square on the right in a similar manner with these kind of semicircular walks. Fountains were added to these squares at this time as well. One had been added in the South Square. They're right in the middle. They're both semicircular. And you can see here on the right that clearly the trees were replanted, sometime in the 1880s to be this small by this photographs around 1890, 1900 probably. Once again, trying to keep them uniform on each side. And importantly, as McHenry Howard mentioned, there are no trees at the ends of the squares blocking your view, like the view that we're seeing to West Monument Street there and one of the Garrett mansions there that's gone where Hotel Revival is today, and your view to the monument. So the other change that took place in 1885 was that Mount Vernon Place began to become a sculpture garden. William T. Walters gave the first sculptures to the city when he donated all the Barrier bronzes that are in the West Square. They're not all in the West Square today. The allegories, you can see two of them here on their pedestals, would eventually be moved to the balustrades, but there is the Barrier lion, this gift to the city of, this very valuable and rare art that was in most people's houses. Obviously made kind of national news when I think this cut is from Harper's Weekly, showing people kind of parading and seeing this display of these Barrier bronzes when they arrived in 1885. So between 1885 and the First World War, Mount Vernon is changing. The Gilded Age, much of the wealth of Baltimore lived around Mount Vernon Place. And by World War I, actually 1917, Mount Vernon Place was really beginning to be on the wane a little bit. Many of the wealthy were leaving to go to the Olmsted suburbs, actually. And so a lot of these big mansions, people didn't know what to do with them. And that became a problem that the city began to become concerned about, as well as the kind of emerging preservation community. But something happened in 1917 that was an impetus for another change, and that is the United States entered World War I. And the French war delegation that was coming to the United States, to Washington, D.C., was going to pass through Baltimore. This included one of Lafayette's great grandsons. And the mayor of Baltimore wanted them to stop in Baltimore so that they could show their appreciation for the French, kind of fighting for their national liberty. And the French emissary said that Mr. It was Mayor Preston, we're very, very busy. We don't have time for this visit. And that's lovely for the gesture, but we just don't have time. And he came up with an idea. In about 2 days, he said, well, while you're here, we will break ground for a statue of Lafayette in honor of the French. And they said, okay, we'll stop. So actually about 50,000 people lined the streets as the delegation arrived from the train station. They went to City Hall. Then they came up to Mount Vernon Place, and at the end of the East Square near St. Paul Street, there was a bed of pansies. We're not sure if they planted them, but this was May. We're not sure if they planted them or if they planted them just specifically for the occasion. The French war delegation broke ground for a statue of Lafayette. It's interesting that it was in a bed of pansies, which is from the French word pensée, which means thought or remembrance. And so, it's wonderful to think maybe this was meaningful to them, that they're basically recalling our debt to France and Lafayette during the American Revolution, and how the French helped secure our national freedom. So with this groundbreaking, the city had a challenge on its hands, which is that they now had to go through with plans to actually erect a statue of Lafayette. And so the city brought in the firm of Carrere and Hastings, yet another, top of the line landscape and planning firm at the turn of the century, as the Olmsteds had been in the 1870s when they were brought in, to create not only a statue of Lafayette, but really to redesign the squares. By the time the plans were really getting going, everyone realized that this location at the kind of lower part of St. Paul was just not prominent enough for such an important figure in history. And so they decided to relocate the statue. It hadn't been designed or even built yet, to the top of the North Square. And here's the original rendering of what that was supposed to look like. As they said at the time, the design was created to install a statue of Lafayette, so that, quote, these two great leaders, Washington and Lafayette, will be historically and artistically grouped together with fitting dignity. And so it was really so that they would be seen together as they had been paired together historically. So here is the original Carrere and Hastings rendering. And you can see just several years later that the design was really completed as they envisioned, that there was new marble work. The statue of Lafayette is there, framed at the top there by trees, clear view of the monument. The shrubbery from the Olmsted period was largely retained. There was a big dialogue in the newspaper about that, about whether it would come or go. And as you can see, the original rendering showed shrubbery there. So Hastings, who was the living member of the firm, said, oh, no, it's going to stay. We're just going to trim it, and we're going to make it work as part of our designs in this case. And so it was completed as they envisioned it. At this time, this is an interesting period. Some of you may know the Parks Department in the city was incredibly robust at this period, at the turn of the century. Since, I think, before the Civil War, under Mayor Thomas Swan, there had been a tax on trolley rides, and this tax went to support the park system, which really gave them a really strong income stream that they were very reliant on. I think it lasted until the late 1940s. And so even, Mount Vernon Place is obviously where, some of the Gilded Age's Baltimore's Gilded Age's richest people lived, but even other parks and squares across the city, Lafayette Square or the Boulevard down Broadway. There are many, many photographs showing them, beautifully planted, well-maintained grass, lots of annuals, which, anyone knows are a lot of work to put them out in the summer and to keep them alive in Baltimore in the summer. So they had a very robust budget at this time. And I'm showing you this bill, not that the bill is important so much, it is for the career in Hastings work. But it's interesting that at this time, the Parks Department was called the Department of Public Parks and Squares. And I think the city realized at this time that under their care, they had things like Mount Vernon Place, which the question is it a square or is it a place or what? That's kind of we'll talk about that in a second. But they realized that they had parks like Druid Hill Park or Patterson Park that were truly large parks. And of course, increasingly they were having the kind of wild parks from the Olmsted extensions and things like that. But then they also had these things like squares, like Lafayette Square or Mount Vernon Place, that were just these tiny little oases in the middle of very dense urban environments. And many of them had a lot of sidewalks and statues and fountains and things like that. So very different functions. Here in this bill, the Parks Department specifically says that they've done the work they completed on the east, west, and north squares of Mount Vernon Place, and they specifically call it Mount Vernon Place. It's interesting and frustrating that at this time in the newspapers, Mount Vernon Place sometimes gets called Mount Vernon Square, and then other times it's called Mount Vernon Place. I think it's most generally known as Mount Vernon Place. To kind of keep the Mount Vernon Place, the east and west squares forefront in the name. But a lot of confusion kind of emerges out of this because it is not a square in that it's not square shaped, but it is a square in that it is a public square, that there's this kind of dense urban environment around it that kind of complicates how people call it. So the Parks Department, like I said, was very robust at this time. And they did complete this project in 1917-20. We're now looking at the West Square, looking from Cathedral Street. They obviously have replanted the Olmsted era trees. They're very brand new here. This was under the Career and Hastings period is when the parks were electrified. And so they went from gas to electric. This was thought to be very modern at the time. It actually made a lot of national news, how Baltimore was modernizing its streets and parks by the use of electricity. And then in the, in the East Square, they similarly, this very dramatic design changed the grade and interior landscaping of the squares. At the time, they were in the middle of the war, so they were a little concerned about spending all of their money that they needed to do to complete this project. And so for about 6 months or a year, they allowed the trees from the Olmsted era to stay. But then the forester came in and said, well, some of these trees, they're dead and dying. Others are not going to live very long. And it would not do to allow these dead and dying trees to just kind of die off and have missing teeth here, or to replant them with little smaller ones, and then they would just all kind of die over time. And so this is one of these moments where the city really planned for the future. And so they decided, probably right at the time this photograph was taken, to replant the East Square with elms. They had previously been, I think they had been maples in that square. And here they are, very brand new. Now, this is a very unusual photograph that was used in the newspaper to begin to show the impact of the automobile on the downtown area. I think this is staged here to get everybody worried that this wasn't such a problem on Mount Vernon Place proper, but somehow they staged this image to show what a crisis down on St. Paul and Pleasant Street, that parking was becoming a problem. Anyway, and the most important thing about this is showing the trees and these new light posts that they installed. And a similar treatment took place in the North Square, where the Olmsted era tree concept of lining the sides was retained, obviously, but these curves were diminished, and and obviously new lights were put in there as well. So we're looking south from about Madison and that. So at this period, a lot of the trees that were planted were elms. I don't think they knew what was going to happen with the elm disease, which I don't know that it was really so much of a problem in Mount Vernon Place in the middle of the 20th century, because many of these elms, and now we're looking at the West Square, looking from kind of Cathedral Street once again, these elms grew quite large. It was a good choice because as they grow up, they're very umbrella shaped and they don't have low hanging branches, or they can be limbed up to have this very high canopy. Importantly, in this image, you can see that those early images show just a lot of grass in the middle and on the sides of the squares. But as the 20s and the 30s continued or developed, increasingly we see shrubs planted along the sides. And you might wonder why. Well, it was a little bare for one. But I think as they began to learn with the advent of the automobile and increased automobile use, more and more cars were going to be parked on the side of the squares, and they were going to be traveling up Charles Street. And so this shrubbery along the sides began to be kind of a border against looking at the cars, or say that was A, looking at the cars, or B, kind of hearing them traveling alongside of the park. Obviously, this was a bigger issue on Charles Street than on the east and west squares, where traffic even then probably wasn't as dense. So this treatment takes place in the east, west, and north parks, where low shrubbery is added as a border here. However, the elms that were there, as you can see, they're very lacy and tall. The biggest branches are, easily 15 to 20 feet off the ground, and so it creates this nice, clear line of sight across the squares. And that was a good planning decision on the city's part when they did that. As all of these plantings kind of matured in the late 20th century, however, there began to be some issues. And around 1980, there was quite a bit of discussion in the newspaper. The Mount Vernon Belvedere Association, which is still here today, was increasingly concerned about safety in the squares. And so we're actually on the upper right there. This is the North Square looking north. You can see actually that the elms that they planted had all died by this time. However, excuse me, the shrubbery was quite dense and really thick. And in the South Square, this is a postcard from about the same 70s, 80s period. The shrubs had become such, you can see this like this very dense border that there's no way to get into the middle of those areas there other than to crawl through the shrubs. There was increasing concerns about safety at this period, and that the shrubbery was providing a place for people to hang out and, muggers to hang out and all this kind of, urban problem issues that made a lot of noise in the newspaper because it was growing to be a concern, and people were just kind of concerned about their safety, which is very important in a public space. So there were questions about, well, what to do about this. And it's interesting that at the time, actually, I'm going to name her, Mary Ann Henderson was quoted, she's still here in Mount Vernon, that she made the point, and this has become a really important factor in park design in the late 20th and early 21st century, that when you're in a public space, you need this feeling like you can see what's out in front of you, and also you can be seen by others, and that feeling of transparency in a park is very important to perceptions of safety, because you just know you can fully comprehend your surroundings. And these shrubs, which were really the issue at the time, were a big part of that. But it also became an issue, for instance, in the East Square, where the city had replanted the elms. Many of them had died by the early 1980s, and they replanted them with zelkovas. So the photograph on the left, your left, is probably the mid 1980s, and then the photograph on the right is from about 2015 when the Washington Monument, excuse me, was being restored. And this was posted by someone on social media from the Waterloo Apartments. And it was interesting that someone looked at this image and said, wow, those trees are thick. And it's true because anyone, as you can see from this image, around the squares cannot even see what's going on the inside of the squares. So that was unlike the elms that the city had planted, which grew to this very high canopy. These zelkovas are very dense and form um, a very impenetrable view, or there is no view, to the squares. So the city actually cut down almost all of this shrubbery in the 1980s as a result of, so here's showing the 1946 in the South Square, where it's not quite as high, but they took this down in the North Square that I showed you a minute ago, took down all of this shrubbery, and then in the South Square, replanted some trees right in the middle there that as they grew up, I don't think they thought about the planning aspect as they grew up. They completely blocked the view of the Lafayette statue when they're in leaf, kind of back to that, fence problem of 100 years ago when they leaf out in the summer. So this is kind of what we're looking at today. And so the Conservancy, one of our charges is to think about a long-term plan for the restoration of Mount Vernon Place. We've restored the Washington Monument. But that our next step would be to restore the North and South Squares. And so we have developed plans that would kind of reinstate that earlier late Olmsted, early Carrera and Hastings period in the South Square, where it's treated more like a garden, but importantly doing things like making sure that the plantings that are planted and obviously opening up the view to the Lafayette statue again. However, making sure that in the design and the choice of trees, that we choose things, for instance, here in the lower area of that square, that have very high twiggy bases, and the canopy is way above your head, so that when you are in the park or when you're on the sidewalks on the other sides, you can actually there is this visual penetration of the space to make sure that you have that feeling of safety that the MVABA talked about in 1980 as a problem, and that here we're showing the idea of flowering, more like a garden, things that would bloom all different seasons of the year, but importantly would stay low and that would not grow tall and get thick and dense like that shrubbery that you saw in that postcard from around 1970 or 80. So there have been many transformations in Mount Vernon Place, as you can see, over 200 years. Sometimes, I guess it is really it is a park, it is a square, it is a garden. It's been all of those things over time, and obviously a very important place in the city. So I'm glad to have been able to kind of walk you through this really quick history. I could talk way more about this, but I see I've gone 5 minutes over what I thought I would. Hope you're still with us. But I'm now willing to kind of, if there's any comments or questions in the chat, I will certainly entertain some of those. Let me close my window here and kind of go back to that. Let me see if anybody's asked anything here that I can get to here. Give me a minute. Let's see. What do we got here? So I got a question. Someone has a question. Is there a plan to address some of the infrastructure issues? Yes. The infrastructure issues in Mount Vernon Place, I've talked about the Carrera and Hastings plan. I mean, that was 100 years ago, and it was installed in 1917 to 20. A few tree plantings in the early 20s, but there has really never been since then, or really before, a significant investment in the infrastructure of Mount Vernon Place, meaning all of the electrics, the power, the drainage lines, the water supplies, all those kind of things. And also, there's never been, and this is ever, treating the soils as a major part of the infrastructure, and that the soils have never been engineered to kind of withstand the use that we have today. I talked about during the Gilded Age. I mean, Mount Vernon Place was a very passive place. You just kind of walk through with your parasol, and you walked out. But now today, people sit on the grass. We have very small concerts, try to keep them on the hardscape. But there's just so many more people that are walking and dealing with this space that the soils themselves need to be engineered to be able to withstand compaction of people walking on them. And also there's no irrigation. So here in the very hot city, there is no irrigation. So that's one of the things that we definitely want to improve, is just really what's going on underground. Another question is, and you can see certainly in the last photograph I showed, there are a lot of steps in Mount Vernon Place, which is a wonderful part of its drama in its design. But there are many areas of Mount Vernon Place that are not accessible. And so our plan that we have to kind of improve that accessibility really dramatically increases the areas that are not accessible to people who couldn't navigate steps. So really reducing it to just a very minor, actually just about where this little chunk where you can see I'm sorry, no, you're not seeing that image anymore. You're not seeing the image where the South Square, the first step up to the area there would be one of the few areas that would be completely inaccessible. So I think with that, if there's any other comments on Facebook or in the chat here that I've not addressed, I am happy to go online after the online conversation here, and we will answer them there. So I'd like to thank you for joining us. Please check out the other online sessions we have today, Saturday and Sunday, as part of Flower Mart, as well as our online vendor marketplace. And if you bought a lemon stick, they are available for pickup at the monument today on Saturday and Sunday. And so we look forward to seeing you next year at Flower Mart. Thanks.